out and flood down the Nile Valley, taking all the silt off the sides of the hills and depositing it over the floodplains along the Nile. They expected it every year. If on years where the flood was low, they would have poor fertility, because otherwise they live in a desert. If it weren't for the Nile, Egypt couldn't exist. So, and we looked last week, there was actually about 8 different Egyptian gods that are associated with the Nile. But the main one being Hapi, who is the chief god of the flood of the Nile, the fertility of the Nile. So, striking the Nile, and this week we're going to look at the second, which is frogs over the entire land. So, and we might get to the third one. I do want to give a little bit of precursor with the plagues. The 10 plagues are basically broken up into 3 main sets and then the final plague. And we're going to see some of the identifying factors of each set. The first one being the progression from Moses the wimp to Moses the savior of the people of Israel, if you will, as Yahweh's representative. We see Moses starting out, woe is me, my tongue is weak, etc. The Lord sends Aaron. So the first 3 plagues, Yahweh tells Moses, who tells Aaron, who tells Pharaoh what's about to happen. The second set of 3 plagues, Aaron is no longer directly involved. Moses is now striking the land. And in the third set, down here, you actually have Yahweh directly, yes, still going through Moses to inform Pharaoh, but directly plagues from Yahweh. And then obviously the 10th and final plague, being the most severe, is not just plagues from Yahweh, but a plague of Yahweh. And we will look at the intensification as it progresses. Particularly with the 10th plague, you get that first person personal pronoun constantly. I, Yahweh, was the source of the 10th plague. He struck Egypt. So, back to number 2, frogs over the land. So, we'll begin by reading in chapter 8. And I'll probably read all the way down through verse 19, which covers the 3rd plague as well, so we can sort of finish that first triad there. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Go into Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says Yahweh, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom, and onto your bed, and into the houses of your servants and your people, and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come upon you and your people and all your servants." And Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the canals, and over the pools, and make frogs come up out of the land of Egypt." So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same by their secret arts, and made frogs come up upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Plead with Yahweh to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord." Moses said to Pharaoh, "Please be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you and for your servants and for your people, that the frogs be cut off from you and from your houses and left only in the Nile." And he said, "Tomorrow." Moses said, Be it as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh our God. The frogs shall go away from you and your houses and your servants and your people. They shall be left only in the Nile." So Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord about the frogs as he had agreed with Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as Yahweh had said. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt." And they did so. And Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast, and all the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them as Yahweh had said. So, we might can get to the fourth plague as well, but we're going to work on these two. The second and third plague they're a continuation of the first theme. So with the first three plagues, the Nile to blood, striking Hapi, the god of the Nile, frogs over the land was a direct assault against Heket, or Hekwit, depending on how you pronounce it. There's about 6 pronunciations. She was the goddess of frogs in Egypt. Apparently they really like them. So we have to remember, in Egypt, frogs were sacred. You could be penalized and imprisoned and potentially even killed for killing the frogs. So the Lord is giving them a very ironically funny, from the divine perspective here. Oh, you like frogs so much you want to worship them? Well, have some frogs. Have all the frogs you want, courtesy of your Pharaoh via the Lord. So effectively, this sacred image, because Heket was also the goddess of frogs, the goddess of fertility, the goddess of abundance. She was also associated with childbearing. So a lot of these, she was a very common household goddess. And that's important because the Lord, in his command to Moses through Aaron to the people here, I want to read it again, picture this. Mind you, she's a household name. And let's read exactly what the Lord says will happen to Moses, or to Pharaoh and his people. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come into your house, and into your bedroom, and on your bed, and in the houses of your servants, and your people, and your ovens, and your kneading bowls. And the frogs shall come upon you and your people and all your servants. So the Lord is taking the frogs here, who are representatives of the goddess Heket, who is a household god, both of the house, fertility, bounty, but specifically with childbearing and the propagation, the fertility aspect, and effectively flipping it on its head and saying, okay, you want to worship the frogs? Well, here's an abundance of frogs. Now they're a nuisance. Now you're going to have to stomp on them. You can't walk without squishing them. You're breaking your own laws. They're nasty because they're frogs, and I hate frogs. They're slimy and, well, you can have them. But effectively, if you look here, well, I don't know if the cuisine had been invented just yet, but I like to picture these, Tim, as these little creeping, nasty frogs, not the big, tasty bullfrogs.
Oh.
Yeah.
Those aren't good for dogs.
Yeah. So, but we see here this idea that just as the Nile was the lifeblood and the Lord's inverting it and making it putrid and reeking and all the fish died, you see here that this idea of their fertility god, their bounty, surplus, it's chaos, as well as now you have an invasion in the house. It specifically says in the houses, in the bedrooms, even in the beds, which I'll be honest, I think is the Lord having some ironic pun there, as well as in the kneading bowls of the bread and the oven. So this idea of bounty, of provision, inverted. He's showing your goddess has no power over these things. Watch what I will do. Pharaoh has to call to Moses and Aaron, please plead with the Lord to take them away. And Moses answers, please be pleased to command me when you shall. And we see a level of Pharaoh's heart at this point. Yeah, he's annoyed. The Nile's been turned to blood. There's frogs everywhere. But in his pride, he's like, okay, tomorrow you shall pray for me and my people. My people are okay suffering through the rest of today and tonight. No big deal. We'll handle it. We're tough. We're stiff upper lip Egyptians here. We'll take it. Tomorrow, Moses. So, and I want you to watch that tomorrow theme as we progress through. Because the Lord, as in many cases, begins to flip everything on its head. Tomorrow you shall plead. So Moses does. The next day, the Lord listens to Moses on behalf of Pharaoh and the people. And the frogs die. Now, the frogs don't hop back into the Nile. They die in place. So now not only do they have an infestation of frogs, but now they have an infestation of dead, dying, stinky frogs, where they have to heap up and put into the square. I'm picturing like a micro version of the piles of people from the plague, where they're having to like heap it up and just get it out of town. Just massive piles, but made up of little frogs. I can't imagine the filth this would have caused. And remember, the Egyptians were the original clean freaks. They would bathe constantly. They like to have everything clean, everything in order. So the Lord is already striking this cultural, taboo here. Yes,
Lord. I think it's instructive. It's interesting. It's instructive in Moses' interaction with Pharaoh. He asks Pharaoh, like you said, when should I do this? And that's so that it's for several reasons. I think for one, it's so that God gets all the glory, and that's Moses' heart. So that you may know. So it's not Moses versus Pharaoh. Which one of us is the greatest? Moses is diminishing, but he's exalting God. It's all about so that you may know. But it's also so that Pharaoh couldn't say, okay, well, it just happened. There's a definitive time in which Moses would pray. And then you also see, I think, some respect from Moses, to Pharaoh, even though he's a corrupt king, he's a king that God has exalted. And so, again, we see that theme all through Scripture, where the man or woman of God is always respectful towards wicked governors, governments, and so forth. And rather than reviling them, he just proclaims the word of God and watches what happens. And then finally, I was going to say, let's see. I thought your point about the arbitrary nature was pretty funny. We'll just wait till tomorrow. I can't remember our last time. But anyway, maybe I will.
Okay. And that's exactly right. What we're seeing is, the entire narrative through the 10 plagues, and then following up with the physical leaving of the people of Israel from Egypt, the Lord is constantly to amp things up. He's constantly making little things into bigger things, making himself, who was unknown in Egypt, to be known as the supreme deity, even with the Egyptians. And we're going to see that. But we also see some parallels, as often he does, where the Lord works, not cycles, but works in series to teach us once, give us an answer, give us an example. If we don't take it, he'll raise the bar, give us another teaching, give us another answer. If we don't take it then, he'll raise it again. And that's really what's happening. So, with the first plague, the Nile is turned to blood. But we also know it lasted 7 days and then it reverts. So while deadly, destructive, and dangerous, yes, the Lord doesn't leave this plague of blood on the people. Secondly, the frogs, they lasted maybe 2 days, give or take the interpretation there of how soon tomorrow would have been. Maybe we're reading maybe it was 11:59 when Pharaoh said tomorrow. Not really, because they didn't use our Roman time system. But still, it was fairly short. And then thirdly, with the gnats, we see the third plague in the first triad here. And this is where Yahweh says to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth. Now, what we see with the dust of the earth, and I will fill in the fake god's name now. For the Egyptians, they had a god of the earth, or the god of the dust, particularly the dust that's important. His name was Geb. He was supposed to be the one who had control over the land, over the physical material of earth. And particularly Lord of Dust is actually a title and moniker. So when Yahweh tells Moses to tell Aaron to strike the dust, and he uses dust, one, it's a strike against Geb because he couldn't control his own element, but also it's an idea here that just as rightfully us, but also other pagans have extrapolated, the dust of the earth also has a creationary aspect to it. It did in Egyptian creation myth as well, because they stole it from us. So, as did all the pagans. Humans aren't creative enough to come up with their own gods without having first an idea of what a god is. So all paganism is simply an imitation and corruption of the true religion. Yes.
What you just said is exactly right, and it's exactly the opposite of what is taught in liberal seminaries and Bible colleges today. The standard methodology is to look at the ancient Near East, see the correlation between the Near Eastern narratives of creation, and then say that Christians are the Mosaic writer, Moses, but they would say it's other writers besides Moses, stole that from them and appropriated it for cultural reasons and for anachronistic reasons and so forth. and it's utter nonsense. As we see in Genesis, and this is so clear, but it's your class on that. But the point is that the other cultures did steal and modify as they went out from Babel, especially.
Right.
They took the true religion and they modified it and turned it into paganism. But anyway.
Yeah. No, and actually, I'm going to have a small rabbit trail on that idea there. So we know in Genesis, the Lord is, I am, the Lord was. And then he says, let there be light, and there's light. Then he creates the earth, and it is devoid of form and water. Okay, then he creates night and day, creates the sun and moon, the sky, the earth. We know this order. We know it to be true. But if you actually, and I did look into the Egyptian creation myth, it's interesting to see how within their own creation myth, the first god is the god of the void, who effectively spits up the god of the sea, okay, who then out of himself lets forth Ra, the god of the sun, Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the god of the sky. Okay, so we actually can see how fragments of the true history are still being carried on. They just decided to really extrapolate and ruin it. And then from there you get the other levels of creation. Now, we know that Yahweh is Lord over all of this. He created it by the power of his word. But you can see that even though they've been removed, Babel has happened, the languages have deteriorated, they still have human conscious fragments, passed down, that there is still shreds. There can be no lie without first being a truth. You can't have a non-truth unless a truth must first exist. So this idea here that everything they've created, this pantheon, they are shreds and fragments of the truth. They have just used their corrupted human imagination to elaborate greatly. So, and Yahweh showing his control over their pantheon. And many of these gods that are struck here are very important, if you will, the top 10 contenders for Egyptian importance. The god of the Nile. You've got Hecate, who is, as I said, a household goddess, incredibly important, right up there with Isis, and we'll get to her. Geb, the god of the earth, with this plague of gnats. He wasn't as much the god of agriculture, but the god of the earth is in the solidness. Well, the entirety of Egypt is either built from stone, typically alabaster, or granite, or mud bricks. So their very structure, everything in the entire country comes from the earth in terms of architecture. They don't have the trees to have lots of wooden structures. Wood was very rare, actually. That's why you see a lot of usage of reeds coming from the Nile. So the Lord striking them with gnats, and specifically the reference to the dust of the earth, is a direct refutation to their god of the earth. Geb has no control over this because he is no god. So, and we see that. So, and this is the final one where Aaron stretches out his hand, or Aaron is directly involved. Aaron's still there, but you see that progression of, by plague number 4, Moses, both probably in his own confidence, but also in the sight of the people, the sight of Pharaoh, as the Lord prophesied, I will make Aaron your prophet and you as God to Pharaoh. You're already seeing this transition to where it goes from Aaron to Moses to fully Yahweh himself. That progressive revelation that we see throughout the rest of Scripture is playing out on a microcosm here, where the Lord starts with what we can handle, amps it up, and eventually you have the overwhelming direct presence of Yahweh in the 10th plague. Now, this is a revelation of judgment as opposed to a revelation of salvation, but the same parallel still plays in, and we see even through this judgment, as we're going to look at, there are places of mercy, places of reprieve. Grace is still given. Even in judgment, our God, in just judgment, is still a God of mercy, even to these Egyptians. And we're going to look at that. The other point of that third plague, which is unusual, is the third plague in each sequence is unannounced. The first two, they're announced, but the third plague here of flies, the sixth plague, and the ninth plague come without warning. It's that amping up. In fact, each of them, so 1, 4, and 7, 2, 5, and 8, and 3, 6, and 9, all have similarities. And just, as I said, it's the Lord repeating his cycle, building, strengthening the argument, if you will. And then in each one we see Pharaoh's heart was hardened. He would not listen, just as Yahweh had said. So even through these great and miraculous signs, the Lord's word holds true that he's holding Pharaoh here for the purpose of making Yahweh's name great. Because I'm not saying I would have caved in and let the people go by this point. I like to think that I wouldn't have wanted my people to suffer. But the reality here is Pharaoh was raised up for a purpose. And his purpose was to make Yahweh known. Remember, this is the birth, if you will, of the physical nation of Israel. When they leave Egypt, they're not just leaving Egypt as in scurrying in the dark. They're leaving Egypt as conquerors. Egypt's in ruin. The army of Egypt is about to get swallowed by the sea. Okay, and then they're marching on Canaan. Well, we know from the text the Canaanite kingdoms are in utter terror. They're terror-struck because Egypt has been dominating Canaan. For the last 100 years, Canaan has been under the control of the Egyptian pharaohs, and suddenly all the pharaoh's men have been recalled, and they're left with no central governance, on their own. And there's this, escaping slaves turned militant, marching on them. This was a terrifying political prospect, and the Lord's making it known that I, Yahweh, am leading my people out. It's very much the conquest epic going on here, with Yahweh at the head. So we see that. Let's see. This is also the point where the magicians, as they're actually called in this case, try by their secret arts and fail to produce gnats. So the first time they duplicate blood, they attempt to call up frogs, which honestly, let's think about this. If the Lord has already called frogs over everywhere, how hard would it be to open your pocket and let one hop out? I mean, can they really call more frogs than Yahweh has already sent?
I think that whole psyche right there is very interesting, and it's still around today. People would rather harm themselves than have to acknowledge the truth of God.
Right.
The last thing you want is more frogs, but assuaging the conscience in order to continue to disobey is far more important to people than dealing with the truth.
No, and that was, one of the things that jumps out is like, the country's covered with frogs. They're everywhere. They're in your bed. They're in your utensils. They're hopping out of your ovens. You can't even bake food without burning frogs. Yeah, exactly. And yet, to, convince the king of the power of your gods, you make more frogs? I really think at this point they're just trying to save their skin, with the frogs. But by the time gnats come around, there is no duplication. This is also the point where they fall away. We see them, that they tell Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. It's at this point that the false priests who serve the pantheon, they're just on plague 3 and they get it. And they're supposed to be the representatives of this divine realm to the Egyptians. And they're already like, yeah, we're done. Okay, stop it, Pharaoh. Stop it now.
How long, or did you say this was plague 2?
Right, okay. So we know that the Nile to blood, the incident lasted a week. We don't know exactly how soon, but it's likely that the Lord was... Some people in scholarly pursuits like to say this was drawn out. I'm not saying it couldn't, some aspects been drawn out, but the text is reading like, this is a battlefront. It's wave after wave after wave. The artillery's firing, preparing for the infantry to march. And that's really how you need to read the narrative. This is a siege of Egypt. So you've got a week. However long it took, we don't know, but the frogs appear, and tomorrow, Pharaoh says, they go away. And then you have the third plague of the triad, where it appears unannounced. And we see that. So we don't really know, but from looking at the various timestamps, I don't think the entire thing took more than about a month to a month and a half, personally. I think it was all in that month leading up to Passover. And it's interesting, that same time is also when the floods should have been happening. The important fertility floods. And yet, there's no direct mention in the text, but that springtime, because you've got, the warming, because Egypt is close to the equator, but Egypt is still on the north side of the equator. So they still have our seasonal cycle just greatly in favor of summer. So when you look at the months leading up to Passover in the spring, you should have been having the thaw in the mountains of Ethiopia and in Sudan with the waters running down, bringing fertility, and instead you're having a divine catastrophe. It was, and we know the timing by some of the later plagues because of the crops that are growing, and we'll look at that. So I don't think it took very long. I don't think Egypt could have survived if it had taken. And it wasn't the Lord's purpose to destroy Egypt. It was the Lord's purpose to make a point out of Egypt. When you conquer somebody, you don't kill everybody. You got to leave somebody to go to the nations and tell how badly you were beat. So effectively, we've completed the first triad of plagues. 3 major gods, or 2 gods and a goddess, have been defeated. The god of the Nile, the god of frogs, fertility, childbirth, renewal, and then Geb, the god of the earth, has all been shown to be powerless. The magicians in the court are running scared, and yet Pharaoh, hard-hearted as he is, holds on. So, picking up in verse 20, we will look at the 4th plague. And by all means, if you have questions, ask them. So, then the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning and present yourself to Pharaoh as he goes out to the water." Okay, this is the second time we get this phrase. This is the same, more or less, phrase used from the first plague. So again, you see 1 and 4 parallels here. Okay, goes out to the water and say to him, "Thus says Yahweh, let my people go that they may serve me." I'm going to stop there. So that "serve me" in the Hebrew is serve or worship. So again, you get the greater narrative of, do you worship/serve Pharaoh, or do you worship/serve Yahweh? Within the textual and contextual meaning, to serve and worship is one and the same. It's either under the dominion of Pharaoh or under the dominion of Yahweh. And that's really important to keep this battle. It really is a account of a siege of Egypt. Okay. "Let my people go that they may serve me, or else, if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants and your people, and into your houses, and into the houses of the Egyptians shall be filled with swarms of flies, and also the ground on which they stand. But on that day, I, the Lord, I will set apart the land of Goshen, where my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there, that you may know that I am Yahweh, I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. Thus I will put division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall happen." And Yahweh did so. So I'm going to pause there. So we actually see a couple come full circles here. First, go out and meet Yahweh, or go out and meet Pharaoh in the water. Again, this idea, so we know by this point the Nile has been cleaned. Okay, the frogs have been, well, they're still in the Nile, but they're at least functional again. So you get this reiteration of the very first plague. I'm sure Pharaoh on his royal barge saw Moses and Aaron coming. It was like, turn it around, or he should have been. He didn't. The advisors like, row faster. I'm not going to finish the rest of that reference. So we see that. The second thing we see there is, again, there's a pronouncement. Yahweh will send flies. So just as the third plague is a unannounced plague, the first plague always comes with a proper declaration. The emissary of the invading king has sent a crier to the wall and is calling up to the people on the fence and says, hear the words of my Lord. This is about to happen if you don't. We actually see that paralleled a couple different times in Jerusalem, most notably when I think both the Assyrians and later when Babylon, when Nebuchadnezzar was sieging Jerusalem, they would send emissaries saying, if you surrender, the people will live. If you don't, we'll kill you all. The difference here is that Yahweh, God of the universe, is saying, surrender now or prepare to die. And Pharaoh continues to resist. But we're also told, I will send flies, swarms of flies on you, your servants, your people, into your houses, and the houses of the Egyptians, and finally, and the ground where they stand. So, you, the Pharaoh, your servants, the royal household, your people, your houses, the houses of your people, and all the rest of the land. So if the frogs covering everything weren't bad enough, you have it spelled out with 6 different points of attack here, where the Lord is about to send swarms of flies. Now, the Egyptians would have been they would have known what flies are. It's a desert. Things die, and they appear like that. But it's interesting here, and the strike against this particular, and yes, I was not driving this morning, so I was able to research in peace. If I can remember which tab I had opened. There's a lot of information research, and I have it put all throughout my head, so sometimes it's good to have a reference. So, the 4th god struck down is Khepri, who was a creation god in some of the earlier myths, but he also was the fly god. So, he's actually depicted with the head of a fly. The Egyptians liked depicting their gods with animal heads because they weren't any more creative. Yeah, fun and creative, right? Sorbek has the head of a crocodile. Hathor has the head of a cow. It was a thing. But effectively, the Egyptian god Khepri was supposed to be this creator-protector figure. Supposed to be on the defense of Egypt, those plagues of flies, all of that. Send them out to the enemies of Egypt, but keep Egypt safe. Well, the inverses here is that the flies of supposedly their fly god, which why you would make a fly god, I don't know. But maybe it was to appease them and keep them away. That's what it was. Is turned around, and suddenly Yahweh's declaring they're going to be everywhere. But this number 4 plague is the first one of the second triad, is the first point that there's a distinction made between Israel and Egypt. Now, up until this point, the Nile all the way up is turned to blood. Okay, there have been frogs over all the land, and there's been gnats all over the land, including the land of Goshen where the people of Israel are. And I think there's 2 reasons for that. One, and quite preeminently, the Lord had to show his people he was God too. They had been 400-ish years in a pagan land. There were no doubt some Israelites that needed reminding. The second reason there is I think he wanted to show that there was no place safe if he so chose. There was no, it was a regional event. No, he struck the entire Nile, which again is the lifeblood, frogs over all the land, etc. But at this point, the Lord chooses to show distinction between the people of Egypt, who he's attacking, and his people. Now, I think it also has the symbolism there of a siege, where if you've got those who are either defecting and coming over, they're taking quarter, or he's freeing his own captives. So you get this idea, again, from a military perspective, to where Yahweh's not just a blatant murderer in this case, which he's not, but in the narrative, he's specific with what he's doing. Everything has a purpose. They're not just wanton slaying. And his people who call on his name will be saved. And we see that difference. So, picking up. And then finally, the last point there, Yahweh's declaring, you will know that I am Yahweh, I am the Lord in the midst of the whole earth. So, this entire event is bigger than Egypt. Remember, Egypt is the political, religious, economic center of the entire known world at the time in the Middle East. So there were no doubt reports of emissaries and newspapers of whatever form they had, merchant reports. These events are going out. I mean, after the Nile turns to blood, you better believe that, a couple of weeks, every court in the Middle East had heard something happened in Egypt. There's a problem. Don't go to Egypt right now. There's a foreign god attacking Egypt, and their gods are useless. Because to their culture back then, everything was centered within their theology. There were no ancient cultures that existed outside of their grand ruling pantheon, their grand ruling god system. So the Babylonians, if you will, might have had different gods, but they also, being polytheistic, accepted the existence of Egyptian gods, and vice versa. So even though their gods aren't being struck down, these foreign capitals were looking at and getting reports from Egypt and saying, well, there's at least a bigger god than all the Egyptian gods down there. Even if the specifics of Yahweh's name aren't fully distributed, as the pagans are good at messing stuff up, this idea here is everybody else around knows there's something big happening on the Nile. So the point that he continues to make, my name will be known, it continues to go out. And finally, in a turn of ironic poetry, tomorrow, Pharaoh, this is going to happen. You don't get to choose anymore. Okay, it's my show, says the Lord. Tomorrow, this will happen. No ifs, no buts. It's a declaration. And it's also the one that doesn't come with chance for shelter. So in our triad system, the Nile, and then here on 4, so effectively, the second one, the fifth one, and the eighth one, and then so forth down, each of the parallels, well, the middle plague, while the first one comes with great proclamation, the second one typically comes with some form of grace or shelter built in. Now, with the frogs, you can say, well, how was it? Well, it wasn't that much, but they did have some forewarning, and it was fairly quickly mitigated. And it's bad, but it's not near as bad as what's about to come. But we will see with the others, there is a level of grace put into it. But in the fourth plague, in this case, the Lord declares what's going to happen. It is a sure sign. Tomorrow, this sign shall happen. And Yahweh did so. There came great swarms of flies into the house of Pharaoh and into his servants' houses, and throughout all the land of Egypt was ruined by swarms of flies. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God within the land." And pause there. So remember, when Moses and Aaron first went before Pharaoh, the request is, let my people go, that they may go worship and sacrifice to Yahweh. So that is this reoccurring theme where every time it gets bad, Pharaoh gives a little bit more, but doesn't totally give in. So here he's saying, well, go sacrifice in the land. Well, as Moses is about to retort, the Hebrews use blood sacrifices as Yahweh has commanded, of bulls, of rams, of goats. To the Egyptians, these were all their divine animals, and while they did eat them, which is a weird thing the Hindus should take up on because it would help their population, but they weren't to be sacrificed. So in Egypt, they had a unique scenario where, despite having a polytheistic pantheon, the Egyptians did not practice blood sacrifices. They're, in fact, the only known culture of any preeminence that did not have a regular, systematized system, for having blood sacrifices. All the other ones around did. Now, part of the reason is their entire culture is, either based on fish or grain or fruits and vegetables. They didn't eat a whole lot of meat. So, and they didn't have a whole lot of animals. And I think that's probably part of that reasoning there. But because of that, this idea of having blood sacrifices, as Moses says, it's an abomination to the people of Egypt. Okay, they would have, seriously shunned them. As Moses says, they'll stone us if they see us offering sacrifices, particularly their holy cows of Hathor, or the ram god of Amun. This isn't going to happen, Pharaoh. It's not good enough. So that's what he gives, and Moses says, "It would not be right to do so, for the offerings we shall sacrifice to Yahweh our God are an abomination to the Egyptians. If we sacrifice offerings abominable to the Egyptians before their eyes, will they not stone us? We must go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to Yahweh our God, as he tells us." So Pharaoh said, "I will let you go to sacrifice to Yahweh your God in the wilderness, only you must not go very far away. Plead for me." Then Moses said, "Behold, I am going out from you, and I will plead with the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow." So again, this theme of tomorrow. This time around, Pharaoh had no choice. Okay, it was tomorrow when the plague was set, and now it's going to be tomorrow when it will be freed. And I can't help but wonder if Pharaoh, in the very first instance, had have said, "Take it away now, please now, don't even leave, pray now," if there wouldn't have been a continued level of mercy there. As we see throughout much of the text, the Lord's not just trying to wantonly slay the people. He's making a point. And if Pharaoh had have humbled himself at that point, I do wonder if it wouldn't have read slightly differently. Because it's almost as if the Lord is reminding Pharaoh every time, your heart was hard and you said tomorrow, you set the bar, Pharaoh, so I'm going to keep it. It's tomorrow when we see that a couple more times through there. Okay, and then Moses gives Pharaoh a warning. Only let not Pharaoh cheat again by letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord. So Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to Yahweh, and Yahweh did as Moses asked and removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, his servants, from his people. Not one remained. But Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go. Yes?
Real quick, I know we're at the end. I just want to make a real quick comment. The theme of division that you mentioned, flies not being in the land of Goshen.
Right.
That's of course a huge biblical theme. It happens again, during the Exodus when there's a division between the people of Israel and the people of the Egyptians. Right. The angel of God appears. Christ, is the angel of the Lord, appears and puts light. Lights up the night towards for the Israelites, but does not do so. The Egyptians are still in darkness, and that's why they don't come near each other all night, as the Red Sea is about to be divided again, and parted. And that according to the analogy of faith, and according to what the explicit New Testament passages say repeatedly, is that you are not in darkness, right, but you are light in the Lord. In the Lord, and so to understand that is how God sees all people, as either of the light or the darkness, either receiving the light of Christ or yet in the chains of darkness. So we always have to think in those terms rather than in a relativistic way.
Right. No, and that's and throughout this, from this point on, the people will be continued divided. There will be provision there, because that is how Yahweh sees the entire world. Either you are for him or you are against me. As Christ said, either you're for me or you're against me. There is no middle ground. So that concludes chapter 8 through number 4. So any questions real quick? With strange ancient happenings. If not, Philip, would you pray for us?
Sure. Father, again, we praise you and we thank you for this time to your word. Lord, thank you for Justin and for the excellent preparation that he has done. Thank you for the clear articulation of your word and of your ways.